Are you tired of creating forms over and over again for your applications? Well, in this video, I've got a component that will help you solve your problem. So in order to create our very own form, first we need to use the Quasar's Form Component. Now, what is this component for? What it does is it creates a form DOM element that allows you to easily validate its child components, namely the inputs, the selects, as well as the fields. So later on, we're going to use these fields, or later on in our future videos, we're going to show you how to use these specific components. So for now, we're going to start with the form first, which is the basis of all our components. So also, do note that the form itself has an internal validation attached to it. So in order to use a form, first we need to create our very own form. So how do we do that? So right now we have a blank slate of an application, right? So what we need to do first is we need to create our QForm, right? Now that we have our own QForm, we need to add a submit handler to it. Submit. What it does is it fires a certain function whenever a submit is detected. So let's use submit form. So now that we have that method, we need to create that method below. So we're going to create submit form, like so. Like that. So now we have a method that gets fired whenever the form issues a submit event. So now that we have a form, what we need now is to add an input. So let's use QInput, which is the most basic type of input in a form. Next, we're going to use the type submit, which coincides with the submit event right here. So now that we have an input, that input was for the button. Yeah, so we have an input, right? So we need to add a label with, do you call this? Let's say your name. So now we have an input with your name, right? So it's just an input with a label, rather a label. So now what we're going to add is a V model. So in order to add a V model, let's say text input. So like that. So text input is equal to null. So there you go. Or let's create a form. So let's use form data, and then let's use an object notation to it, and then let's set text input to null. So in this case, what we need to do is we need to add form data dot text input. There you go. Now that we have an input, what we need to do next is to create a button that fires the submit event. So let's create a div, and then let's add a Q button. And then we're going to add the type submit this time. So I'm sorry for that. So the type submit allows the button to fire a submit event that gets triggered right here, and then gets handled by the form right here, or rather by the function. So now that we have a submit button, let's add a label to it. Let's say submit. So something like that. So now we have a very basic type of form, right? So now that we have a form, let's try to alert, let's say your name is, and then let's append our name. So form data text input. Let's use the this notation to signify the object. Okay, so going through with what we did, we created first we created a QForm, which is the container for our form itself, and then we added a submit event. Next, we appended a function to that submit event, which is what gets triggered whenever we fire the submit button. Now that we have that up and running, we now added our own input, which is a basic form of input, which is a single input with a label your name, and then we appended a vModel to it using an object. Next, we created a button with a type of submit, which handles the submit event, or rather, which is the what do you call this? The one that fires the event itself. So once you click the submit button, the form catches that event and fires, or rather, and calls the submit form function. Now, in the function below, what we did is simply alert the text wall content. So using it, now that we have this div, let's try to let's containerize the div first. The div is way too wide if you take a look. Okay, so let's grab this one, let's put it here, and then let's add some styles here. Let's say max width is, let's say, 300 pixels, something like that. That should suffice. So there you go. And then let's add some padding here, QPTMD, to add some space between these two. There you go. So as you can see, now we have a very basic type of form, right? So if I type something and then I click submit, the alert fires. So as you can see, we created a very simple type of form, right? So what we just did is we created the form with a function that fires whenever you click the submit. So taking that into perspective, imagine that you have a, what do you call this? A simple form in your website. Let's say, for example, so you want to ask for your, let's say, visitor's name, address, or rather first name, last name, and let's say age, right? So let's just keep things simple for now. Rather first name and last name instead. Okay. So in our case, what we did was the entire name, right? So imagine your website has those two requirements, the first name and the last name. So taking this example in that context, in order to create something like that, first you need to create a QForm, which is this one, right? So you need to create the container for your form, which is the QForm itself. Next, we're going to add a submit to that in order to catch the event whenever we fire the button submit, right? So as you can see here in our example, we have a function that gets fired whenever we click the submit button. Now that you have that up and running, you need to add two inputs, which is QInput. And then you need to add a label to that and then append that to a specific vModel. Now the vModel is important in order to bind our component to the data itself and make it reactive based on the basic Vue syntax, right? And lastly, you need to add a button, which is a button with a type of submit that allows you to fire a submit event. So when you click that button, the submit event gets fired, therefore getting caught right here, or it gets caught by this function. So once you click the submit button, this function fires, and then you can do something with it, you can do whatever you want with it. So in our case, we simply alerted the value of the input. So that is the most basic way of creating a form. Now you might ask, since we are now able to create a form, how do we expand our form itself? So you will notice that we created an input, right? So if we have an input here, what we can do is we can explore what the input basically does. So going back here, let's try and find the input itself. So as you can see, the Quasar's QInput is a component used to capture textual input from the user. It uses vModel, which is similar to a regular input. It also supports error validations and comes in a variety of styles, colors, and types. So as you can see in this right part of the screen, you can customize the input in many ways. Like, just look at it. So we're going to scratch the surface because we can't cover everything because there's just way too many of these. So what I'm going to show you is rather some of the things that you can do with Q input. So as you can see, first let's start with design. So here you have some examples. So you can set the standard, or rather you can set the specific design of your input based on these properties. So by default, we have the standard, this one, right? So if we say that we want a field, we simply add that property, and then our input changes content as well. Or let's say you want an outline. So if you set that to outline, it looks something like this. Or let's say you want to set a borderless input. So you simply replace this one with a borderless. So now you have a borderless input like this one. Or let's say you want a rounded type of input. So let's say rounded. So what's going to happen is nothing, right? So in order to see the rounded shape, you need to add outline. So if you do that, you will see the rounded shape, right? Or you can say that you want a square outline. So let's say square. Something like that. So what it does is it creates a square which is outlined at the same time. So that's just one of the ways that you can customize your inputs based on your needs. Next, we have coloring. So we can apply colors to it as well. So in order to apply colors, you need to simply add this one. You need to add a color property in order to change your input's color. Or let's say you want to change the background of the input itself. So you need to add a BG color, which is this property right here. So if we try to implement that on our side, we simply need to add a color, let's say teal, and just for fun. So now we have a teal type of input. So let's say the color is white. So what we're going to have is a white color as well. So we can't see the white because our background is white as well, right? So let's set the BG color to teal. That way, we can see our input right here. So that is just one of the ways you can customize your Q inputs. So you also have this what you call dense input. So what do we mean by dense? Basically, what dense does is, if we remove this, rather let's keep it there. If we add the dense property, what happens is our input gets squashed, meaning all the padding on the surrounding element itself gets removed. So you get a denser look and feel, meaning it's more compressed and more compact, which is very useful for tight spaces or for those, what do you call this? Those types of screens that don't have enough real estate, so to say. Or rather, you don't have enough space, so you need to compress things in order to fit them. That is one way to use dense. Also, you have a field. What do we mean by field? So what it means is basically your input is filled with this dark background right here. So if we do that, let's remove the dense and let's set it to filled, what you're going to get is something akin to this. If we remove the background like that, you get this dark shadow looking area in your input. So that is what the field, which is this property, does. So aside from that, you also have outline, which is what we just used right here, right? So if we remove the field and then let's add some color, let's say teal, and let's see, just keep the background by default for now. So what outline does is it creates an outline to your surrounding element, right? So you can see this line right here. So that is line, or what do you call this? Outline. So that is what it does. You also have standout. So what does standout look like? So if we apply that, simply need to remove this and then let's add standout. So something like that. What happens is if you click your element, which is like this, it stands out, meaning it adds some nice colors to it in order to make it look and feel unique at that point in time, making it stand out, hence the name. So that is what it does basically. So as you can see, it really does stand out. Looks dark and it looks bright. So aside from that, you also have the borderless. So what does borderless do? It allows you to create inputs which seems to blend with the environment or which seems to blend with the background. So let's say borderless. What it does is it allows you to create an input without any line whatsoever. So as you can see, like this one. So there's no indicator that it's an input at all, right? So it's very useful for those instances where you want to, what do you call this, to remove those line looking things, right? So this is one of those use cases. So let's remove that for now. So it goes back to normal. So the rounded design, on the other hand, allows you to, to add some border radius. So in order to see that in action, we need to simply add outlined, and then let's add some rounded. So what's going to happen is you're going to have this rounded looking shape right here. So it adds a border radius on all four corners. So that is what rounded does. The square borders, on the other hand, does the opposite, meaning it removes the border radius completely, leaving you with a square border. So for the dark background, you simply need to add a dark property. So by adding that property, your element converts to dark mode. So that is one of its effects. So for the basic features, you can expect that every Q input has a native attribute attached to it. So what does that mean? What it means is that your Q input elements have the native attributes of an HTML input. Meaning, if you add an input type, what do you call this, text or whatever type you add to it, it gets carried over as well. So you can treat a Q input component similar to an input HTML tag because that is what it basically is. Meaning a Q input component is rendered into an input HTML tag. So all the native attributes of an input tag is included in a Q input component as well. I hope that it's clear to you guys. So aside from that, you can also add a clearable prop. So what it does is it allows you to clear the fields of that input. So let's add the clearable. So what happens is, in order to apply that, what we need to do is you need to add a clearable first. And then you need to add, you need to add a clear icon. So let's do that. So now we have a clearable property and a clear icon, right? So in order to make that button appear, you need to add a textual element to your input. So if you don't have any input at all, the close button will not appear, or the clear in this case. So let's input a sample. So as you can see, now that we have an input, the clear button also appears. And once I click this one, the content disappears. So it's a very useful feature if you want to immediately clear content on your Q inputs. For example, one common use of this is the search box. So in a search box, commonly you have a clear button right beside that, right beside the input, right? So it allows you to clear the content quickly. So that is one useful feature of this property right here. Next, you have different input types as well. So in this case, like I said earlier, the input types is equivalent to an input type property of a native input, which is HTML, right? So if you say Q input and then you add a type password, what you're going to get is a Q input with a password behavior like this one. But in this case, you have a password with a toggle, so you can see the content, right? So in order to create something like that, you need to add this specific functionality right here, which is what it does is it simply swaps the type based on this value here. So if you click the icon, it swaps the value from off to on. And therefore, since the type the type here is a computed property and is bound to this value, whatever this value resolves to becomes its type. So therefore, you can switch between text and password. So what it does is it basically swaps your input type between text and password. So that is one very, or rather, that is one tip on how to implement that kind of functionality. So in this case, we have an input type email. So if I type something like this, or let's say test@mail.com, so it is considered an email input. So here you have a search bar as well. So you can type something like this. So for this one, you have a telephone number. So definitely it expects a telephone type of input, right? Because if you take a look at the code, you can see this, what do you call this? This type. So you have the type tel, which signifies telephone. You have a URL, you have time, as well as date. So you have all of these types, which is already available on a default basis, because each input has different kinds of types by default, which is the native functionality. So aside from that, you can also use an input which is a number. So in this case, you can set it to something like this by simply adding the type number. So by default, it has that functionality. But what do you call this? In case you want to in case you want to input a file, they have a recommendation to use the Q file instead, which is, as you can see, this one. So here they created this sample native implementation of a file input. But Quasar suggests that you use the Q input with a type of file, or rather, instead of using that, you may want to use Q file instead, because it gives you more functionality and much better or robust capabilities compared to the native one. So aside from that, you can also create a text area by simply using the Q input, and then you need to set the type to text area. So aside from that, you also have a prefix and a suffix. So what does these things do? So basically, the prefix allows you to add a specific string for every input. So in this case, you have a suffix, right? So you get this nice thing here, right? So the value of this input is the string plus the suffix itself. So that is what you get as a value. So that is one way of using the prefix and suffix. So for the prefix, let's say you want to add dollars, so let's say 100. So what you get is an input of $100. So that is one way to show or to allow users to visualize properly some certain aspects of the UI, which requires functionality such as this. So aside from the prefix and suffix, you also have custom labels. So you can add your your own labels to your Quasar inputs. As you can see right here, they created their very custom label, right? So in order to implement that, you need to use the label slot in a Q input. So you need to use the template object, which allows you to create your very own label, which is, in this case, they use the V slot label. So also, aside from that, you also have shadow text. So what does shadow text mean? As you notice, if you click this form here, the input has a nice looking shadow thing right here. So it gets a bit darker, right? So if you click this other input, it gets darker as well. So taking those into consideration, in case you want to apply this functionality, what you need to do is you need to add this specific property, which is this one. Yes. So you need to add a shadow text. So that shadow text allows you to set a shadow looking thing in your input. So that is one way. Aside from that, you also have a debouncing model. So now, you might ask, what is a debouncing? Or rather, what is a debounce? So imagine that you inputted, let's say, certain, you inputted a lot of, no, let's change, let's say, okay. So let's say you created a lot of text, right? So you pressed A, for instance, a lot of times. Or you hold the let's say you type a lot of input, something like this one. So it's a very fast input, right? What the bounce does is basically give you a delay before firing the function. What do you mean by that? As you can see, if I type here something, it takes a while before the model updates itself. It's not instant per se. So if I type something like this, it takes 500 milliseconds before the model gets updated. So it gives me a lot of time to first type whatever it is I want to type, for example, like this. And then after 500 milliseconds, that is the time that the model changes. So this is a useful feature for those instances where you want the user to first type a lot of stuff or do a certain input first, because reacting to it in a real time would cost a lot of resources. So there are instances like that. So in this example below, they delayed it by a single second. So if I type something, it takes entire seconds, or rather it takes one entire second before the model gets updated. So that is one way of saving resources and computational power. Also, you have a loading state for input. So as you can see, it has a loading input, or rather a loading state. In order to implement that loading, you need to simply add the loading property and then add a vModel instance to it to signify whether it's true or false. So it's as simple as that. Now, for the mask. Masking is an important part of inputs, right? So it allows you to dictate what inputs you would like to appear in your input fields. So for example, like this one, let's say you want your content to look something like this. So if you add a mask property, if I type a number, it imitates this exact feature or this exact, format by default. So how do you implement a mask? You simply need to add a mask property and then you follow the syntax right here, or which is, these are the tokens rather. So let's say you want your input to be, let's say 5 numbers, or let's say 3. So you need to add three characters like this in your mask property. Let's say you want to add a specific character. Let's say in this case, they added a slash. So you need to add a slash to your mask. But notice that any character that matches these tokens gets matched as a specific value. So in this case, if you add S to the mask property here, what it's going to do is it's going to accept a letter. So if you add, let's say 5S, 5 letter S, what is going to happen is you can only input 5 letters in your text field. So that is what masking does. It allows you to specify what exactly you want with your Q input field. So as you can see here, if I type several numbers, it gets automatically formatted for me. That is what the mask feature does. So that is an important aspect in order to, let's say, if you want to impose certain conditions on your text field, let's say you want like this one, it's a card number, right? So, or rather a serial number. So in this case, if I type a letter, it gets automatically formatted and at the same time it gets validated. So even if I keep on typing a letter, it won't appear. But if I type a number, it will appear because it is detected as a valid value, which fits the mask. And again, if I type the letters, it will appear as well. But if I type numbers here, it won't appear. Meaning, the mask allows you to enforce a set of rules for your inputs, which is a useful feature in order to avoid user errors, which is common in inputs, right? So if you set a specific format for them using a mask, you won't have that much problems anymore in regards to validation. So that is one way that you can minimize validation. So aside from that, Quasar also has a capability of using third-party mask processors. So in case you want to process your mask a different way, you can use that here as well. So they have several examples for that. So also, like we mentioned earlier, you can validate your input fields. So in order to validate your input fields, you need to add specific rules for that. What do we mean by rules? Rules are basically, they are functions that return either a true or false. So as you can see here, their example, you can validate QInput components with the rules property, specific array of embedded rules, or your own validators. But if you want to add a custom validator, it must be a function that returns true if a valid or if it is a valid value, or a string which is an error message if it is not valid. So again, let me repeat that. The rules property is a property that allows you to validate your Q inputs. The rules property must be a function if you would like to roll your own custom validation. So if you want to customize your validation, it must be a function that returns true if the value itself is valid, and return a string which is the error message when the value is not valid. So I hope that's clear with you guys. So if you have, or rather if you're confused with this, please do let us know in the comments. We will clarify that for you. So based on that explanation, you can create convenient rules like this. So you have the value, which is the value of the input, and then you have a condition, and then the error message. As you can see here, what it means is if the value passes this condition, or meaning it satisfies this condition, it returns true, right? So the valid or the validation is okay. But if it does not satisfy this condition, it's going to return the error message, which is a string. So for example, you have the value. So imagine the value is the value of the Q input field that you have. So what the first line does here is the condition itself. So the value must include the hello string. So if it includes the hello string, it will return as true, meaning it is valid. But if it is false, what's going to happen is it's going to fall to the other side. So therefore, you need to return a string for that in order to tell Quasar that the value is invalid, and therefore allow it to return an error message, which is the one you specify right here. So that is how you validate your input. So let's try to implement that one. So in order to, let's just try implementing this one. So let's say you want the field to be required. So in order to do that, we simply need to add our own rules. So something like this, right? So what it means is that if the value is not a value at all, meaning the field is required. So in short, we're just going to flip the value twice in order to make it return a truthy value or a falsy value. So if we do that, the validation appear, or rather, there you go. So what it does is it validates our field. Since what it does is it just validates your input if it is, or it has a content or not. So if I type something here, it goes away because the value, when converted to into its opposite, is a false, but when then converted again, comes true. But if you do that with a blank, it is a false. So as you can see, it throws you an error. So that is what this rule basically does. So it's a basic form of validation. So that is one way of validating your inputs. Aside from that, you can also use external validation. So in this case, they have a specific validation, which is a function, as you can see here. So that you, aside from the internal validation of Quasar, you can also roll out your own custom validations using this property. Lastly, you have the native form submit. So this one is useful for those of you who are using Quasar with, let's say, ASP.NET controllers, or for those of you who have, or for those of you who really need that native functionality of a submit. So this one is a very useful feature for those of you who want to use that specific functionality. So again, to repeat, the native form submit is useful for those of you who would like to use the native functionalities of an input, meaning we don't have that much customization. In this case, you're using Quasar with ASP.NET controllers. So that is one, or rather that is one use case where you can apply the native form submit. So with all of these available options to you and customizations to choose from, as you can see, there's really a lot of them. So you can customize them to your needs, and you can fully customize them based on what you need your your input to look like. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you learned something from it, as well as I hope that it helped you in your problems regarding forms. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment down the comment section. Or if you see that this video has helped you a lot, please don't forget to leave a like as well as to hit that subscribe button. Again, this is Joshua from Pixelate. See you later, Pixelators!